So first of all, I would like to thank Amos for inviting me again. It's always a great adventure to be here, and I get a lot of stimulating thoughts, and also Amos makes you think about things you didn't think about before. So we had some discussion before this, and he said, so what's the workshop about? And he said, values, information and value. And I said, okay, so you mean economic value? He said, no, just value. So I said, that helps. And then of course, my idea was, so does information have value, and specifically intrinsic value? Does it have value in itself? And of course, my first reaction is, as probably maybe most of you would say, no, of course, it's all relative. You get informed, but then again, I thought, actually I also lecture on aesthetics and computational aesthetics, and actually the position I defend there is that you could actually construe that information has some intrinsic value. So I'm going to talk about that, and also about embedding this question in some of the history of philosophy. So that information has an instrumental value, and in this sense, depending on your goals, can be very useful, is out of discussion. That's very clear. So if you want to go to the station and I ask somebody, could you tell me the way to the station, and I get the right information, this has value. But this is, of course, instrumental, it's derived value, it's not something that is it's very interesting philosophically, but not in this context. But does it have intrinsic value? Well, we'll have a look at that. So first, some candidates for intrinsic values. There's a lot of them. Truth, beauty, they're the oldest one, and already there starts the discussion, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so it never can be intrinsic. It varies from person to person, it's subjective. And actually I kind of doubt that, whether it's really that relativistic. I'll come back to that. But in all this list, does information play a role? Could you say that you really have something of value if you only have a piece of information? That's an interesting question. There's a number of ways to look at value. First of all, based on the probability of the data. There's a descriptive complexity aspect to it. I'll come back to that. Amount of computation involved, I'm not really talking about that. And a very interesting concept is the Levin complexity of a data set. I'm not going to talk about that either. And then the last one is based on the amount of model information in the data. And that's one I hope to kind of linger on a bit more. So, but first we give you a crash course in philosophy. These are two oaks, somewhere near the river Stour. And of course, an old philosophical question is, what makes an oak an oak? And how can we actually, what does the predicate mean if so many different appearances of the same thing occur in real world? And philosophers have been thinking about that for a long time. And of course, it used to be a problem in Greek philosophy, where this idea of a tension between a completely static model of the world, of philosophical interpretation of the world, that you find with Parmenides. He said, there is what there is, being can never change. And on the other side, Heraclitus, that he says you can never step into the same river, everything streams. And of course, these are good starts, but views that have very little possibility for development. So the first development was, of course, Plato. And Plato hypothesized this world of extratemporal, extraspatial, immutable forms that would explain that, let's say, this world exists, and what we see in our world is just a kind of mere reflection of these forms. And of course, the famous cave allegory kind of explains that, where we are kind of prisoners looking at a wall while behind us our forms are carried by people. We only see the shadows. And if we could go outside and be in the sunlight, and then for the first couple of hours or days, we would be completely blinded by the light of this insight that we would get. I'm kind of treating this or mentioning this because this form, this notion of form, the Greek word morphe, the Greek word prolepsis, idea, are the ancestors of our notion of information. And when Cicero and thinkers like Augustine translated the Greek text into the Latin, they used for all these words the word informatio and informare. So, and also interesting that the meaning of this word originally was much richer than what we have. A book carrying information is a very un-Greek notion. The original notion in the Greek text is as a process. So the sculpture informs a piece of marble. The pupil is informed. The forms are planted in his mind. Later on, information then is understood as a state of an agent, and only very late in the 19th century, you could have a book containing information and having the disposition to inform somebody. So our modern notion of information has had quite a long history. And if you want to know about that, read my lemma in the Stanford Encyclopedia on this subject, because I'm kind of going into that more deeply. So, but then you see there's an interesting relation between the notion of form and the notion of the traditional philosophical notion of form and the modern notion of information. So then, of course, immediately the question arises, if you're a real philosopher, so what is the status of these forms? And everybody that has done let's say, a 2-day course in philosophy knows that there's two positions on that. One is by Aristotle. He said these are really existing entities outside our space and time. They have a kind of ontological status. And Aristotle was a realist, said, yeah, they are there, but we read them off of the things in reality. They're not there apart from the things we see them represented in. So this is and of course this discussion has dominated philosophy for the next 2,000 years. There's an interesting, let's say, kind of more modern view, which was Occam, and most people here know Occam as a kind of early representative of Occam's razor and minimum description lengths. But philosophically speaking, his position was to actually, what is called cut off the beard of Plato, do away with those ontological objects in this outer, let's say, world, and simply take the real world for real and not add any entities that you don't need in your philosophy. So he has this famous saying, entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. We'll later see there's a deep relation between this kind of set of thoughts and modern philosophy. But it's interesting to see that this is, and the position, the extreme position that was developed it's a kind of Aristotelian position that was developed in the Middle Ages, is nominalism. A species is just a word. The fact that I call you human is just a word. So this is, and of course, this is one problem. Another problem is, and this was not so much recognized in antiquity, but in Middle Ages. One author even says that God couldn't know us as individuals, because God was living in this world of ideas, and we as individuals were only individual by means of sets of errors that accumulated. We were all, let's say, part of this high mold, this idea in the world. But as individuals, what made us an individual was not really very important to God, because he was only thinking about this kind of, let's say, universal ideas. And of course, you can also, this is a visual illustration of the fact that this theory is wrong. Very wrong. We both, I don't think that the guy on the left is Pieter Adriaans, with whom I was kind of, people thought I was him, but he's long dead, here in Washington 2 years ago. But even if we are like each other, we don't stem from the same mold of the Dorifor of Polyclites. I hope that's clear. So that's a crash course in philosophy. Now information. And there's lots of forms of information, and the value question can take some different forms. So I'll first go for information as probability. And I'll ask you, if you want to solve a crossword puzzle, what would be this word? And you probably don't have a clue. I'm not going to wait till you kind of give an answer. If I left out 3 letters, if I leave out another 3 letters, you probably immediately are home. This is, of course, Xanthippe, the wife of Socrates. Now, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the letters that I left out the first time contain much more information than the letters that I took out the second time, and it has to do with their probability. So there must be some kind of notion of value involved here, that helps you kind of, well, the second set of letters helps more to guess the word than the first one. And of course we have a good theory for that. It's Shannon information. The information content is a negative log of the probability. And there is some kind of notion of value involved. But it is, of course, I would say indirect, it is instrumental. The probability of an object doesn't seem to be directly an intrinsic capacity of this object. So we go to some other form of information. Actually, I've got the mathematics here based on the probability of letters in Dutch. And above we miss about 25 bits of information, and below we miss about 12, 13 bits of information. So we can really quantify this. Second example of experiment. Two layouts of pieces on the checkerboard, and which one is easier to remember? Well, of course, that's clear. There's a small, good description for the one on the left. So the theory explaining that is actually Kolmogorov complexity, or one of the theories that you could use to explain that. We need much more kind of information, a longer program or a longer piece of code to code the information on the right than we need for the information on the left. So actually, so randomness, having maximal information, having a lot of information, also seems to have some kind of association with value. For instance, knowing that a string is random has an enormous value. We cannot prove randomness of any string. So really knowing this is a long string and it is random, if you're a cryptographer, this is the main prize. It's something you really would value. And you could actually argue that being random is intrinsic to a string. It's not something that is relative to, it's even in the Platonic world, if there's no people or in any universe, a random string is a random string and it's valuable for encryption. So, okay, we're coming close to possible conception of value. And again, there's mathematics of this. In the second form, we have about 80 bits of information here, about 10 bits, give or take a few. It's a nice illustration. Also, there is a problem here. Low entropy, much order, little information, easy to remember. High entropy, much disorder, lots of information, hard to remember. But it doesn't lead to the observation that the more randomness or entropy I have, the more information I have. This is, from a physics point of view, this is very clear. If I have a low entropy set, it can do work. I can use it to kind of drive a steam pump. If I have a high entropy set, there's no free energy left, and there's nothing I can do with it. And of course, due to the second law of thermodynamics, this is the way all systems go in the end. So this doesn't seem to be a good way of talking about information. Also, I've added, this is a standard picture from Microsoft from a couple of years ago. If you add noise to this picture, statistically the size as a JPEG file goes up, so you get more and more information. But for some reason or another, we don't have the feeling that that is the most informative picture that you could think of. So is there a way of thinking about model information, useful information in data sets that we can actually use to solve this? And of course there is. So there's a lot of proposals. I'm not going to read them. If I have a low entropy set, it can do work. I can use it to kind of drive a steam pump. If I have a high entropy set, there's no free energy left, and there's nothing I can do with it. And of course, due to the second law of thermodynamics, this is the way all systems go in the end. So this doesn't seem to be a good way of talking about information. Also, I've added, this is a standard picture from Microsoft from a couple of years ago. If you add noise to this picture, statistically the size as a JPEG file goes up, so you get more and more information. But for some reason or another, we don't have the feeling that that is the most informative picture that you could think of. So is there a way of thinking about model information, useful information in data sets that we can actually use to solve this? And of course there is. So there's a lot of proposals. I'm not going to read them all. And they're all kind of aiming at a related cluster of IDs. One is that the string is interesting if a lot of computation went into it. Another is that the string is interesting if there's internal phase transitions. And then a third one is a string is interesting if there's a balance between model information and ad hoc information. And they're all channels between those conceptions. They all point in the same direction. So I want to actually use one derivation that's familiar to possibly a lot of you as an example of how to deal with this. So suppose that we have a universe. In this universe we have a data set. We have a possible model, and both are finite for the moment. And we want to find the best theory to explain these data. Well, one way of doing this is using Bayes' law, and then the best model, you simply go over all the models, you apply Bayes' law, which is, of course, the probability model of the times the probability of the data given the model divided by the probability of the data. If you tweak this around a bit, and for me it's one of the most beautiful derivations in the computer science. So first you maximize your probability. Then you also can maximize simply the sum of these terms, and you can actually maximize the logarithms. And then you also can minimize the negative logarithms. And then actually you come into a two-part code definition, where the first part is the model code. It is the Shannon code for your theory, and the second part is the Shannon code for your data given the theory. And this is called two-part code optimization. It's been around for quite a while. But this is an interesting way of looking at information. So for any data set, you can actually do this operation, and you come up with this kind of separation into two fundamental different forms of information. Yes? What? Argmax. It's finding the maximal value. So you go over all the models in the universe, possible universe, and you select the one that maximizes this term. Yeah? Okay. So, this is actually, here's where the philosophical part and the modern part come together. There's a principle by Rissanen and others that the best theory to explain a data set is the one which minimizes the sum of the lengths in bits of the description of the theory and the lengths in bits of the data when encoded with help of the theory. And you could actually recognize this as a modern variant of Occam's razor. To give somewhat more mathematics, if you have a data set in red, then you come up with a whole kind of, you can actually compress this data set into model code and data to model code, and you get a lot of things you can measure from the data set. So the total of the model code and the data to model code is its Kolmogorov complexity. The compressibility is its randomness deficiency. So if it's not compressible, the string is random, and actually in some ways it's value, but it doesn't contain any real information. And the length of the model code is what I call the facticity. Other call it is related to the notion of sophistication, which is a very interesting notion. So suppose that you have a data set, you compress it into an operational part and an ad hoc part, and there's lots of mathematics, and this is actually where the work of Duncan and me comes together, about this model part and what you can do with it. That is a very interesting field of research at this moment. But let me give a possible interpretation of this. One of the ways of looking at this, I'm not going to go into the mathematics because for most of you it won't be familiar, is so this model part you can actually interpret, philosophically speaking, very grandly spoken, as one part is a machine you define and the other part is the input for the machine you define. And this is highly non-trivial because you get actually, I would say, two, maybe even not ontologically different, but completely different forms of information. And it is here that I'd like to make a small jump to work of Luciano. If you look at his paper on Lemma on semantic information in Stanford Encyclopedia, and also your little booklet on, I think it's called Introduction to Philosophy of Information, but I might be wrong. So he has this idea of having a classification of types of information. I'm not going to dive into too deeply into that, but there's well-formed data, then you have semantic data with content, and he separates that into instructional and factual data. And I very much believe that if you'd like to keep this ontology, that the following is happening. So the well-formed data actually, the data that can be operated on by a computer are well-formed in a certain sense. And actually we are compressing the data in something that's highly non-trivial, namely an instructional part, which is the program that goes into the computer, and a factual part. And now my I would say, main hypothesis that I've been working on for the last few years, and it's getting corroborated by the day, I'd say, is that the facticity of a data set is the amount of factual information that can be extracted for us. And there's lots of interesting things you can say about this facticity. For instance, and Duncan doesn't believe it is non-robust. If you tweak a bit of the data set, the models really can change dramatically in size, the facticity. So that's, but that's interesting. So you have a data set, which is whatever, something you measured on Mars or radio buzz from the universe. There's a theory that tells you to compress it into two types of data, one of which is the model information, the factual information. And of course, factual information is useful. It's the facts, it's the species information, it's what is generalizable of this data set. And there's a nice piece of mathematics of this. So, tentatively, suppose that this is, up till now, this is hard mathematics. Now we go into kind of more speculative mood, philosophically spoken. Given a universe that can store information in which computation can take place, well, if you want to have computation, you need space to store information, otherwise information is extensive. You need time, because otherwise you can't have state transformations. And you need stable data configurations with low energy transformations, because you want to have flip-flop stuff and things like that. If you have that, then you can actually interpret this traditional notion of let's say, universals of model code of whatever, in terms of this mathematics of two-part code optimization. The theory that you get then I would call empirical particularism, but forget that fact immediately. But the idea is that you have an individual's description and you can immediately read off his model information. For lots of reasons, I find that a very attractive view. For instance, for medical reasons. I think that the medical treatment that I might need, is completely different from the medical treatment that Ariel might need. And the fact that we are both human only partly explains what would be necessary if we got ill. So there's a lot of model information stacked in both of us as individuals that is not related to real species information. So this is, and you can actually work out this whole view as in the direction of an ethics, an aesthetics, certainly ethics maybe, but I'm not going to do this, of course, in the course of this talk. But the idea would be that, if you want a slogan, is that the particular is the universal. You read off the model directly from the data of an individual. Okay. So then we have an interesting answer to the question, what does it mean to be an individual? Not this. There's not some general mold. Of course, we share some DNA, which is interesting. But it's about 1 to the power of 10 bits of information, most of which there's a lot of information that actually is damaged and different. And apart from that, we started completely different adventures in life. And there's no guarantee that there's a lot of mutual information in our individual descriptions. So basically, the computational view of being an individual would be, well, I start with Mr. Justinov, I start with Mr. Adriaans. I compress them in a model code, in a data to model code. And there's no philosophical or mathematical reason to have a lot of mutual information there, which in a way gives you a kind of answer to this universalia problem. It's not nominalistic. It's not a mere name. There's real mathematics, but it's not an immutable universal form. And if Amos was talking about, let's say, has information value for life, I very much believe that these kind of mathematical principles are important for understanding what life is, how genetics move on, how game playing between people move on, how art develops and things like that. So I very much believe that there's, and it's only a research program, but that there's a kind of deep connection between these insights and the original questions that Plato and Aristotle started with. So, well, let me see what else I have. This was the main message. Oh yeah, so these are old slides. This actually made me do this talk. So, for instance, you can use this to really to your benefit in aesthetics. So in aesthetics we have realism, you have idealism and schematization. And realism is, representation is isomorphic to the data. Idealization is ideal schemas optimally compress the description of a set examples with errors. And schematization is optimal compression under bounded complexity. And for those who are familiar with complexity theory, you can actually use Kolmogorov structure function to analyze these kind of cases, where you say, I want to have the optimal model of Duncan Foley, but in 10 bits. And then you get maybe something like that. Okay. So you even can understand characterization. So what happens is, if you have in your brain somewhere a universal model, which is somewhere in the middle, then it's interesting to model somebody's individuality, stressing the differences between the universal model and the person itself. And then you get these kind of cartoons. Of course, the lady on the right just died. And the other one is Madonna in a somewhat younger form than most of us know her. So, but then again. So I very much believe, I've written a little booklet about it, that these kind of model extracting like capabilities play a role in human cognition. And one thing is fairly obvious, that you have about 130 million receptors in the human eye, and the channel sending this information to the brain is only about 1.5 million, has about 1.5 million kind of telephone lines. So a lot of compression even is already taking place in the eye itself, in the retina. And we know, I could talk about this for ages, but this has a lot to do with the way we see art. My rule is, painters can get away with very schematic abstract images because the brain compresses and expands the information and kind of fills it up. Okay, there's for the connoisseurs, if you have facticity, you can define conditional facticity. You can actually define the factual value of information. This is the one bit that makes my whole world view kind of shatter. I'm not going into that. We're developing models, kind of analyzing that stuff at this moment. So things I'm working on, or could work on, or have some students work on, is the notion of an ideal teacher. He always gives you the optimal information from which you can derive the optimal model. He kind of gives you the maximum learning capabilities. You can do mathematics about it. Game playing, what happens when people start to anticipate each other's moves in a game. There's a colleague of mine posed the problem of what does surprise mean in a musical composition? So surprise you only have if you already have a model of the piece, of the music. So it's a model breaking exercise. So first you have to build up an expectation of the model, and then you have to give information that it breaks. Very interesting notion. So in the same way, you could actually have a model of kind of evolution of art, where people get bored if they see the same things, and well, you know, are fascinated by new developments, but not too new. And there's lots of other things. I'm not going too deeply into them, but a big issue at this moment is neuroaesthetics. And I'd say that part of the neuroaesthetics can be explained from the fact that the human brain is an information processing device. So, just as a kickoff, I got this morning. There's a colleague of mine, he used to be a student of mine. He's doing his PhD with another professor on evolutionary art. So it's basically art that's made by genetic algorithms. And so at one point in time, he had problems finding the right fitness measure. And it turns out that the notion of facticity, as I kind of developed it, well, seems to lead to interesting pictures. It's a measure for interestingness, so we expected that. But unlike other of these aesthetic measures, in the end they end up always a black square or a very after a couple of generations. I'm not going to explain it really. The first picture you see Shannon entropy as a measure of facticity. The second, Shannon entropy with much more advanced bins. And then there's a number of approximations using JPEG, JPEG 2000 and PNG. So you get, if you start a genetic algorithm with some seedings and after some generations it comes up with pictures like this. This is not science, just enjoy them like I do, and we're going to think about this later. Interesting thing is it's very different. It's the same set of algorithms with different fitness measures. So it's really, it's kind of asymmetric. It goes one way and then it optimizes in that area. And you see that by avoiding, avoiding either model information or randomness, it's kind of eating its way to an artistic space, which is, I think, kind of interesting. So, to make a long story short, the example of the trees, we can now explain. Yeah, there's some genetic information, but we shouldn't actually see it as a kind of universal predicate that completely describes the behavior of these individual trees. The model information, the thing I need to know about these trees very much is dependent on their individual histories. So this one is dying and probably will fall down, and the other one is very young and stuff like that. So that gives you, and my idea would be that the mathematics of this model code, which is sound mathematics, is kind of inspirational. I'm not saying I've explained things, but it's kind of inspirational for a research program in which you kind of rethink part of history of philosophy and universalia along these lines. And I've given you some hints of what's possible there. I thank you very much. I want to take questions if there are any. My view would be that it's not at all sufficient to address somebody, or give somebody rights because he's human. Of course, that's the beginning. My view would be that the first would be an anti-rationalistic stance. The first thing we have to, I would say, admit if we are talking about ethics is that we might be completely different. And that the only, I would say, medium in which we can exchange ideas is this computational environment in which we can communicate. But there's no, to use a term from the Frankfurter Schule, there's no Antizipation der ideale Kommunikationsgemeinschaft or so. There's no ideal community that we anticipated will ever, there's no, it's anti-Platonic what I'm thinking of. You're the first step to a different species, I must admit that. So it might be that we never come to an agreement. And so if you want to build up an ethics from that, you have to say, well, it should be very pragmatic. We should at least agree on how we organize society, food, safety for each of us, but not from an anticipation that there's some rationality which we share. That would be the outline of the ethics that I would kind of, which is, by the way, very much in line with how I think about life, but that's, yeah, is that the answer to your question? Oh, well, yeah, well, it could also be a computer, maybe. That's. Well, it's not. He might be suicidal. You know, I wouldn't understand that, but there's nothing that he might want to rule the world. He might want to destroy the world. There's nothing that he might think that he might have religious views that I find appalling. So there's nothing that I would say that a priori we would be agreeing on, apart from the world being there and some operational constraints in the world being there. That would be my and also I think there's a lot of Platonic, I would say, totalitarianism. What is it? In the declaration of let's say the French Revolution, equality, all those Platonic theories about ideal structure of society have something. There's a famous book by André Glucksmann, Les Maîtres Penseurs, and he says every philosopher, the first thing he tells you, you're free, but this might not be the case. So every philosopher starts to address you as a human being with. And I think it's worthwhile to look the other way around. You're completely different. So let's try to start from that. Also in a modern context, multicultural society. I don't understand your religion. I don't understand your values. I don't share them possibly. But let's try to make life worth living.
I want to understand better the separation between the model code and the data for the model code. So you said at one point that the structure of this model code can be quite sensitive to. Now, I mean, if we think about it as a question of science, where we want to create a kind of a universal theory that we apply to initial conditions, we may be able to view the model code as kind of the theory and in the initial conditions. Now, now one problem of, I mean, whenever you build a scientific theory, you're not merely describing a world, you're also kind of creating an interface to cognition. So you put additional constraints about what is an appropriate model code. Alternatively, if you think about a computer language as giving you the model code, you may want to have a model code produced in one kind of computer language versus the other. I'm wondering to what extent this method allows us to add additional constraints on the model code to be able to fit additional, like the cognizer or something like this.
Well, first of all, the mathematical theory I'm doing, so what I presented to you, this two-part code optimization using Bayes' law, this is the kind of popular introduction to the field. It's not the real mathematics. So the real mathematics, you use Kolmogorov complexity and you search a whole space of machines and indexes. It's not constructive, but you know that certain machines are there with optimal indexes. And actually quite some thinking went into proving that this was definite. So you get I would say the intrinsic measure is inherited by the proofs that do this by Solomonov and others that do this for Kolmogorov complexity. The instability was a surprise to us. We first thought that you would have very simple sets with low simple models and very on the other sets totally random strings with also simple models because it's just sufficient statistics, and it would be a kind of mountaintop. What it appears to be is that if you look at if you have entropy here and the model size here, and you take the strings of length k, our approximations using, for instance, Markov models of the models of these strings show that first you go up and you kind of make deterministic models of your strings because they're very simple. And then suddenly your deterministic models collapse into stochastic models. And we've talked about this earlier. So this is, I have not talked about this right now, but this is related to the Crutchfield and Young observations on Turing machines. It's related to percolation stuff. It's related to chaotic systems and edge of chaos-like phenomena. So there's a rich potential of applications there. It's also in artistic metaphor, I'd say it's also responsible for the fact that one brush stroke can ruin a good painting. So it certainly collapses into something that doesn't have a real model anymore. Does that answer your question a bit?
Not exactly, but maybe we should talk.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So